The tragic killing of 15-year-old Eliane Andem has put renewed focus on the problem of knife crime. Andem was the 15th teenager to be killed using a knife so far this year in London, and knife crime does seem to be on the rise. In the 12 months to March 2022, there were 282 murders involving a knife or sharp instrument in England and Wales. That's the highest total since 1946. When statistics began. Now, that statistic bucks the trend of overall crime, which has generally fallen since the mid-1990s, though even with overall crime, there has been an uptick in recent years. Now, on the reasons for the increase in youth knife crime, an audience member said this on BBC Question Time.
I've worked with young people since 1985, so I've seen a systematic change in the way that young people and adults interact. Mark, I have to say, please stop using statistics to defend the undefensible. You've stripped local government of youth services. You've taken responsibility away from councils that had proper youth provisions that the communities were a part of. I've grown up in Manchester, I'm nearly 60. So they had MAGs, which is the multi-agency gang, when Mossad was going crazy. They had community members, they had youth workers, they had social workers, they had a whole range of professionals and people involved in the community. And the community could police themselves. But the Conservative governments, through austerity and these give police back the powers, you had community policemen who knew the community, who knew the people, but you're ramping up powers and you're forgetting people. It's people, and all you're interested in is the law and punishment. Whereas if you talk to people, I've been into jail with young people that are in jail, and you talk to them as a human being and you show them the consequences of their actions. Even in gang culture, these rules, these regulations, but you just don't see that and you don't hear that because one, it doesn't touch your life, and two, it's a party political vote and a game. So stop playing politics with people's lives, because you'll say tomorrow, oh, no, you do. You've done it systematically. And you do this every time somebody passes away, somebody's killed. But you've created the environment.
That was such a thoughtful, such a well-considered intervention from someone in the audience with clearly like a very, very deep understanding of what's going on here. But that didn't stop a Tory MP from, giving this clip a ridiculous, I have to say ridiculous, quote tweets. This is Brendan Clark Smith. As a former youth worker myself, I'm sorry, but this is absolute garbage. Talking about this member of the public. When I was younger, I didn't carry a knife, loot local shops, or go around chopping trees down because the youth club wasn't open. I found something to do. My parents also cared about my whereabouts. And the reason this is so stupid, and I think offensive also because it completely misrepresents what the person in the audience was saying. Now, the person in the audience wasn't saying that any time, someone stabs someone, oh, that's because there wasn't a youth club to go to. No, of course, these things are always going to be complex. There's always going to be a number of reasons as to why that happened, as to what led up to that. Of course, also, the closure of youth centres doesn't diminish, or it doesn't remove, let's say, personal responsibility from the kind of people who sort of partake in these actions that have terrible consequences. But that's not the argument that the audience member was making, right? And it's not the argument that any sensible person would be making. The point of having youth centres, having services for young people, is that you will have less people going into the kind of lifestyles where you end up committing knife crime, right? You'll have more people who have more purpose in their life, have more reason to sort of care about their futures, so that they see the idea of either, getting stabbed themselves or getting arrested as a real problem. I feel like if you're going out in the street with a big knife, that suggests that you probably don't have that much concern about the possibility of getting arrested, because you don't think you're going to have a particularly sort of interesting later life anyway. It suggests to me that there is an element of nihilism, which is probably because you don't have enough hope and opportunities for your future. So obviously, if you have more youth clubs, if you have more youth services, knife crime will go down. There will still be knife crime, right? And you can never say with any one incident, would that have happened or would that not have happened, were there more social clubs? But I think what we can be pretty sure about is if you reduce provisions for kids, which give them purpose in life, then you will, on average, see an overall increase in knife crime. And Aaron, I want your view on this, because I just think that comment from Brendan Clark-Smith to that thoughtful audience member is just so offensive, because he's also implying, the audience member is suggesting, well, we can't blame these kids for stabbing people because, I had personal responsibility when I was a youngster. That's not what's being argued.
I believe in personal responsibility, but you have to set the person up in a way that they're not being set up to fail. Because then, they aren't responsible entirely, are they? And that's the left-wing argument. But I don't think it's an either-or. Fundamentally, Michael, and this is something that's just beyond debate. There's no debate, okay? More equal societies are less violent. The lower inequality is in a society, the less violent it is, the more happy people generally are. Generally. You can look at the Nordic countries and rates of suicide, and we probably say that's because of climatic conditions and whatnot. But the overall global trend is precisely that. So, for instance, the quintessential argument here is really Japan. Very, very low inequality for such a wealthy country. Now, of course, the conservative would say that's because they have the death penalty. That's because they have low levels of immigration. And they have, it's a very traditional society. And the left will say that's actually because they've got, low levels of inequality, and they've got social institutions which, broadly speaking, most people of most backgrounds can access. And they have a shared culture of respect. And this is very brief. Obviously, I'm not giving all the nuance that I possibly can, but I think that's what it boils down to. As somebody on the left, I'm happy to listen to the arguments, or greater authoritarianism will mean lower crime, less violence. But that doesn't seem to be the case in the United States over the last 45 years. More people incarcerated. You don't see recidivism, reoffending falling. You see greater violence, really. Although, like you say, many crimes have fallen since their peak of the 1990s. But school shootings, for instance, have just rocketed. The idea that higher incarceration rates have made society less violent in the US, I think is clearly been debunked. But that, to me, is the place you have to start, Michael. More equal societies are less violent. If we want a less violent society, of course, violent things will still happen. People will still be murdered. That will happen. That's always happened. But if we want to reduce the number of those things, we do want lower levels of inequality. We just do. Now, that doesn't mean I think everybody should be made equal. We should have no inequality. I'm a socialist. I kind of think that. But I know that's the kind of pastiche of the argument that the conservatives would make. But you could say, well, look, even if we just aspired to go back to levels of inequality that we last saw in the late 1970s, we would see substantially less violence. At which point, of course, they would say, well, it's a moral outrage that you'd be taxing us so much. What about aspiration? I want to get on. Okay, well, fine. That's the trade-off you're willing to make. That 5% of society can do really well, can live the life of Riley. But more broadly, society is dysfunctional. High streets look like shit. We have higher levels of stabbings. We have more social dysfunction. Okay, that's the trade-off you're willing to make. Just be honest about it. Just be honest about it. Now, I'm not saying inequality is the root of all of these problems, but I think that is where I would start. And then secondly, Tories and the right, they love to talk about the family. They say this is because of a broken family. Did this young man have a father around, and so on and so forth? Well, of course, economics and inequality massively inflect the ability of parents to raise children. Of course they do. We don't live in some purely spiritual world. We live in a physical world where there are constraints on what you can do. If you have two parents working 12 hours a day and there's no free childcare, then it's very difficult to raise a child in a nice, calm family environment. It just is. So I find it really strange that Tories don't want to act really on healthcare. They've said they're going to do some stuff under Jeremy Hunt. I believe it when I see it, frankly. But they've scrapped Your Start. They do very little on childcare. They do very little on inequality. And like you say, they've scrapped cornerstone services that do a really basic, obvious thing, which is to keep young people off the streets. Simple as that, right? I think if you do those three things, I think if you lower inequality, I think if you give parents more resources to raise children really well, which we don't, we make it as tough as possible to raise kids right now in this country. And I think if you bring back the kinds of services you spoke about, Michael, that's a great start. Okay. And I think if you did that, you would see a massive fall in the kinds of crime that we're talking about.